We've got Jason Priester from the Clemson Insider here for our first Clemson versus LSU preview of the year. Jason, thanks for doing this, man. I appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure, man. Always fun to talk football with you, bud.
Yeah, it's always a good time, and it's extra fun now because we have an actual game. We're finally breaking down a game, and I think this LSU one is especially interesting because both teams had 4 losses last year. Both maybe end of the year a little bit disappointed, but not a total bust. LSU couldn't run the ball worth a lick all year, 4.1 yards a carry. Clemson was better, but by the end of the year with Maffa hurt, they couldn't really run the ball at all either. They both bring back maybe the 2 best quarterbacks in the country. So I see these two in some regard is extremely similar. On top of all that, Clemson last won the national championship in 2018. That's the last time they won a playoff game. Very next year, LSU won. That's the last time they won a playoff game. So maybe not like on a team level, but at least like a program level, they're in a similar spot. How are you feeling broadly coming into this game?
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, there's a lot of similarities here. I think there's a big game for both these programs and for the same reasons for both these programs. You know, both of them need to win an opener. They've both kind of not been very good in openers recently. Neither one of them wants to start out 0-1, but yeah, you look at the rosters and kind of see where some of the strengths are and some of the weaknesses are, and they kind of align. You know, like you just mentioned, both teams kind of struggled at times to run the ball last year. They both got really good defensive fronts. They both got really good wide receivers. They both got really good quarterbacks. I mean, there's definitely a lot of similarities. I think that makes it that much more intriguing, to be quite honest.
Right. And, you know, I saw someone on X saying that the regular season's so watered down, especially the non-conference games. And to some extent, that's true. But I think there's, at minimum, some sort of a cultural thing here where if Clemson loses, sure, they could still get in the playoff. But it's almost worse if Clemson can win the ACC, but they lose what would be their 4th in a row against the SEC. So there's a lot of other things on the line besides just a playoff berth, and 6 straight season openers to lose for LSU would be brutal. So that's a lot about similarities. I want to highlight one huge difference, and that's in the trenches where Clemson brings back 4 starters on the offensive line, and LSU loses 4. And I don't know that Clemson's ever done this, at least not in my memory, but 4 guys drafted. Will Campbell in the top 4 of the NFL draft. I don't recall that happening at Clemson with 4 guys going and won that early. So an incredible amount of NFL talent leaving. They got Braylon Moore from Virginia Tech. They got Josh Thompson from Northwestern. Still, how worried should they be about that offensive line against Clemson's D-line?
I think it's definitely a worry. I get it, man. They've got some talent there. They brought in a couple of guys from the portal, like you just said. But it's one thing to have talent, and it's another thing for them to have time to gel. If you listen to some of the reports coming out of some of the practice, it sounds like the defensive lines kind of whipped them a lot of, at least for a majority of camp anyways. You know, and for me, if Clemson's going to win this game, I think that's one of the biggest where they've got the biggest advantage. That defensive line has to own the line of scrimmage, control the line of scrimmage, however you want to say it. They can't let Nussmeier sit back there and get comfortable and have those receivers having all day to get open. You got to keep him in the pocket, make him uncomfortable, rush him, or at least rush his throws. And with Clemson's defensive line, I think that's a big point of emphasis. You know, no matter how good they are, man, they've just not played enough together to have that time to gel, or you would think they wouldn't have anyways. I mean, it's not saying it's impossible or anything, but chances are there'll be some hiccups, and that's a place where Clemson needs to take advantage of the advantage they have.
I agree. I think that's the biggest advantage either team has in this game is Clemson's D-line versus LSU's O-line. At least presumably it should be. And Nussmeier, I think he's a really elite quarterback, and we can get into him, but he didn't get sacked a whole lot last year, but despite being number 2 nationally in pass attempts. Pretty incredible. They basically had no run game. Defenses knew the pass was coming, and they still couldn't get to him. He's not very mobile. He had negative rushing yards. Despite all that, they kept him upright. Now they lose 4 guys and are going up against a D-line that should be a lot better. And so let's maybe before we get into the quarterback battle, which we certainly got to talk about, but I'm hearing a lot. I heard it from kind of little snippets from Tyler Venable, kind of like a culture change. And I think that might be a bigger deal than schematics changing on this defense, but it seems like it's a more player led. I just think of that time after Clemson lost to Duke, where Barrett Carter admitted maybe he wasn't in game shape. And this team just feels so much different. So maybe it's not about the schematics that Tom Allen brings, but the cultured shift he's brought. Are you picking that up? I know you're closer than I am.
Yeah, there's definitely a different feel or a different energy or a different attitude, however you want to put it. You can sense it coming off those guys just listening to them talk. That there's a lot of confidence within that group. I've heard so many of them talk about how, matter of fact, I forget which one of them safeties the other day. It might have been Kylon Griffin talked about, and he said, "Dumbed down." How the defense has been dumbed down. That's exactly how he said it. I think that was part of the problem last year. Is it just got so overly complex. Guys were, doing too much thinking instead of reacting and making plays. But it sounds like, Allen's not only kind of, as you said, changed the culture, changed the mindset, changed just the attitude overall. It sounds like what he's doing is much more simplified, and it's allowing guys to play more freely and make more plays, play faster. And I heard several of them talk about how they're more aggressive. And I think that's something they sorely lacked last year.
So I think that may be the biggest thing to watch. Is this defense wasn't good last year. We could talk about the rushing defense. LSU brings back Caden Durham, who was a freshman all SEC last year. If he was running against Clemson last year, he had 5.4 yards per carry. He would do a lot more than that against Clemson last year. But this culture shift and obviously getting more talent and Will Held getting more experience with, pretty much everyone else. How good do you feel about this defense in particular against the run?
I think they're going to be much improved. It's not like they could be a whole lot worse. When you talk about yards per carry, I think it was the worst number since the 70s. But yeah, you can just sense there's a hunger. I thought listening to Tyler Venables the other day, some of the things he said were kind of insightful, talking about how they got scarred up last year and kind of using that for motivation. And there's now so much more, they're a year more experienced. They got a little taste of the playoff last year. And for a bunch of these guys, it's going to be their money year. You just kind of can sense how hungry some of those guys are on that side of the ball. Particularly with the upgrade at the spot opposite TJ Parker. Yeah, I think they're going to be much better against the run. I wouldn't shock me if they ended up being top 15 in the country. I could see that kind of improve. I'm not saying it'll happen. I'm just saying it wouldn't outright shock me if it did.
That's a kind of shocking turnaround, and yet everything I'm hearing makes it seem completely feasible. TJ Parker was what I was trying to think of before, and he mentioned how there's more accountability, another thing that kind of pokes that culture change. But we got to talk about this quarterback matchup because it's maybe the best quarterback matchup there'll be all year in college football. Garrett Nussmeier had 4,052 passing yards, a PFF grade of 84.5, and a 29-12 TD to interception ratio. And you got to give him a little bit of grace on some of the efficiency metrics because they basically made him pass it every time with very little run threat. Klubnik was able to be more efficient with at least some run threat. 36-6 is an incredible TD to interception ratio. 89.2. I think it's top 10 in PFF. It's excellent. 3,639 passing yards, not quite as good as Nussmeier, but also fewer attempts. I think they're both elite. I watched Nussmeier at least a few times last year and was super impressed with them. Your thoughts on these two?
Yeah, I'm with you. I think it's going to be one of the best quarterback matchups in the country all season. I have extremely high expectations on that front, but I'm kind of curious to see, how they can protect Nussmeier. You talked about how he had to throw so often last year, over 40 attempts per game. That's slinging it around. And another thing is, as good as Klubnik was last year, I think there's still another step he can take. I think there's some areas in which he can still improve. I think he can be better at scanning the field at times, and he still every now and then will lock onto a receiver when he shouldn't. I think that's some stuff that he'll get better with as the more he plays, the more experience he gains. But yeah, that might be The quarterback play, that might be one of the things I'm looking forward to the most in that game. It's been a long time since Clemson's had a matchup of this magnitude at home at night. So, that's obviously top on the list, but the quarterback matchup would definitely be a close number 2.
Yeah, honestly, this might be the last time Clemson hosts a game quite like this, because with South Carolina and now Notre Dame on the schedule for 12 years after next year's road trip to LSU, I think those are your big non-con games. I don't know that you get an LSU, a Florida, a Tennessee, an Auburn, an A&M. I don't know if you get that again for over a decade.
It
So
would not surprise me to see some of those SEC games they've got scheduled already to see them go away.
I think the Georgia and Oklahoma games are extremely likely to go away.
Yeah.
We'll see. I guess it's not official, but I almost just assume it will. So that almost adds a little bit more excitement. Maybe not. Maybe it doesn't make it impact the playoff more, but it adds a little oomph to it. So talking about these great quarterbacks, Clemson's obviously got a great wide receiver core. LSU leaned on the portal to sort of rebuild one. They brought in Barry Brown, who had 100 yards against Clemson back in that Gator Bowl when he was on Kentucky. They brought in Nick Anderson, who was pretty much hurt most or all of last year for Oklahoma, but the year before he was a freshman All-American. They bring back Aaron Anderson, 5'8" junior slot receiver who had 884 yards last year. To me, he's maybe their best option, and maybe would stress Clemson's linebackers. Your thoughts on how Clemson's secondary now without R.J. Mickens, who is kind of always my guy, always the guy who I think is the most underrated guy we've had in a long time. Can they hold up against that group?
Severely underrated, man. He was so good last year.
He was so good, so critical. It never got
it's
a whole soapbox for you.
Does not get the credit he deserves. For me, with those LSU wide receivers, I think the biggest thing is just the speed. They've got a lot of speed at receiver. That's why I think it's so important for the defensive front to win the battle at the line of scrimmage. Because I don't know, and it's not a knock on Clemson's secondary. I just think their receivers are that good. I don't know that you want your secondary having to hold up for 4-5 seconds or what, too long against those receivers, because at some point they're going to get open. That's again, I just think that's why it's so important not to let Nuss get comfortable in the pocket and get into a rhythm, because they are really good at receiver. If there's a team on Clemson's schedule that matches up with them, talent-wise at wide receiver, it's this team right here. This is, we talked about the battle of quarterbacks. This is 2 really good receiver rooms doing battle too. Clemson fan, you mentioned Barry and Brown. Clemson fans are overly familiar with that guy from the Gator Bowl the year before last, but he's just one of several weapons they've got, man. They've got a bunch of them. If Nuss has all night to throw the ball and he can get in the rhythm, man, that is not the recipe. That's not the recipe.
Yeah, I think if LSU wins this game, I think it's because their O-line at least battled to a stalemate, if not won the day. I think that's their toughest thing they have to do, and if they do it, or if they win, that's probably why. So I think the passing game is sort of the headline of this. You got the 2 best quarterbacks. You got 2 great wide receiver cores. LSU was better stopping the run actually than the pass, and they couldn't run it. So maybe that relieves some of the pressure on Clemson's possibly poor, at least was poor last year, rush defense. But let's talk about the run game at least a little bit. It sounds like Adam Randall's going to be the starting running back. Your thoughts on him, and then who's the number 2? I've been hyping David Iziomume all offseason. He was amazing in the spring game. You think he's going to get a decent amount of carries? You think it's going to be something else? Your thoughts there?
Yeah, going back to the spring, I really thought that if Adam Randall came out of the fall camp as the starting running back, it was going to be just temporary, and that Gideon Davidson at some point would take over. I'm not so convinced of that anymore, even if we're talking a month down the line. I've just heard that many good things about Randall and his performances in camp, the 2 scrimmages in camp, that he's been that good. It sounds like Easy's been taking a lot of the second string reps, and that, with Haynes still being out, and Davidson is kind of pulling up the rear there. But yeah, I don't think that we're going to see. I don't think it's going to be like it was last year, where they're just relying on one guy. I think they saw, or I hope they learned last year that you got to have more than one running back ready and that you can trust. Because once Maffa went down last year, they or got hurt. They just didn't have any answers there that were ready or that they fully trusted when he got hurt. So I think they've made it a point of emphasis to have multiple guys that they feel like they can lean on. So I feel like we're going to see a lot of Randall with some easy mixed in. We'll see how much Gideon Davidson's involved in that first game for whatever reason. Dabo tends to not like to play those true freshmen in these big openers. We saw it in Wesco and more last year. We'll see if that changes this year. He made it sound like yesterday on that interview he did on the ACC network that that all three guys would get some carries, but we'll see exactly how many Gideon gets. I'm kind of looking forward to seeing what Randall does, man. I just never, and I watched him in high school, run the Wildcat, and he was a natural runner, but I never would have envisioned he was going to be the starting running back at Clemson this year, even going back to in early spring, when we knew it was going to be a permanent move. I just felt like it was going to be one of those stopgap type things until Davidson got ready. But, man, he has exceeded my expectations, or at least based on what I've heard anyways.
I'm really excited about him, really happy for him. I feel like, I guess for the last 3 years, he's been overly hyped every offseason, and I've never been a believer. And I was, I don't know. He doesn't get open. Maybe he's not that fast. Let's see. He's always hurt. I always had a reason to not buy in. And I'm feeling totally the opposite now. Evidently, Eric McLean and Kelly Gramlich on their podcast just interviewed him interviewed not Adam Randall, Coach Sweeney, and asked him about the move. And he said that after that ACC championship, he went to Adam Randall and said, Adam, what do you do best as a football player? And he said, run with the ball. And he said, exactly. I don't want you to transfer. Stay through the spring. Let's try this. And supposedly it's going really well. I could see him being really, really good in this role. And I think it's a great kind of Clemson story of sticking it out.
I go back to the big media day they have every year at the start of, right before the ACC kickoff. And when Dabo said he really believed, he said, I might be wrong. I am wrong from time to time, but he said he really believed that Randall's going to be one of the great college football stories this year. Now, whether he becomes that or not, I don't know, but I don't know. It just feels like he's going to be really good there. I just think he's going to have a good season. I think he's got a chance to kind of, you talked about his first 3 years. He's just not lived up to expectation. And I think he's got a chance to kind of reshape his legacy with this move to running back.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Jason, thanks for doing this. I always appreciate it when you hop on. Always enjoy it too.
Always a pleasure, man. Appreciate it, Ron.
Thank you to our sponsor, Ready Vets. If you live in the upstate and have a dog or cat that needs immediate care, Ready Vets is the place to go. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe.